Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining here today. Today we have two speakers. First, Zoltán Lakatos from Budapest University of Technology and Economics. And his discussant is Kevin Namey from University of Quebec. And then after Zoltán's presentation, we'll have Toni Čerkez, from Tallinn University, and discussant Victor Jimenez Rivera. Will you introduce yourself? And before we start, and to start us in a good way, I'd like everyone to think about the traditional, ancestral, and indigenous territories, lands in the heavily colonized world in which we live, and think about where you are. I am joining here today from the ancestral, never surrendered, unceded, which means stolen land of the Tk'emlúps Tshikwatin people in Secwepemc Uluk, and today known as Kamloops, British Columbia, Canada. So grateful, so grateful and happy to be able to live and learn and work in these beautiful healing lands, to remind us all that, acknowledging territory reminds us constantly of the violence of colonialism within which we still live today. So, having acknowledged territory, I'd like to pass it on to Zoltán Lakatos for you to start your presentation. Would you like to share slides, Zoltán?
Yes, I do. So thank you very much. Let me switch to the screen sharing mode. Here we go. Can you see my screen? My slide?
Uh-huh.
I've lost that. Let me revert to here. Is it okay?
I think so. Yeah. It's working.
So you see the title. Okay,
yeah.
So hello, this is Zoltán Lakatos from the Budapest University of Technology and Economics. I'm going to talk today about what's called mainstream value research and substantialist value discourse in general, and how and why their theoretical framework is comparable to pre-18th century epistemology. Now, for an illustration, here's a quip by Mitt Romney, the Republican presidential candidate campaigning in Israel in July 2012. This is an article from the BBC website. Speaking in front of about 40 donors in Jerusalem on Monday, Romney said, "You see the GDP per capita, for instance, in Israel, which is about $21,000, and compare that with the GDP per capita just across the areas managed by the Palestinian Authority, which is more like 10,000 per capita." Specifically, Romney was referring to The Wealth and the Poverty of Nations, the title of a book by Harvard historian David Landis. And he said that he had concluded from the book that if you could learn anything from the economic history of the world, it's this: culture makes all the difference. He was right in that narrow sense that David Landis' book indeed made that point. Now, independent media and critical scholarship do a reasonably good job deconstructing comparable narratives as reductionist and misleading, racist even, but academics, I would say, have an additional responsibility in locating their scholarly connections. This is just one example. David Landis was not a sociologist, but his work fits the substantialist template nicely. Scholarly texts like this one are instrumental in producing what Foucault termed governmentality, the disciplining power of seemingly commonsensical theses. So here are some key figures in substantialist values discourse, including mainstream value research. Hofstede was Dutch, Engelhardt American, Rokic on the right, Polish American, Welzel is German, and most influential of all is of course Max Weber, on whom I expand quite a bit in the manuscript. And there's others, but uniting them is that their works show confusions regarding the symbolic and material aspects of human conduct, and these confusions give rise to false problems that are nonetheless politically influential. Yeah, here I apologize for the serial quote assembled from various chapters of a text by Christian Welzer, because I've brought it up at least once, in front of some of you. But it's so illustrative of the issues with the substantialist school in value research that I simply can't help. So it goes like this. Emancipative values create new social capital, bring wider civic entitlements among both Western and non-Western societies, change people's life priorities, increase rather than decrease unselfishness. Hence, they also increase social movement activities, and hence people's self-regulatory capacity, and as a result, bring more, not less, self-restraint, do not operate against critical assessments, but actually encourage them. Therefore, critical citizens are the product of emancipative values. End of quote. So here you have it. Values have agency. They do the acting. They propel, they drive, they push, steer. They steer their containers, us humans. Hofstede, the Dutch, the dean of mainstream value research, coined the phrase software of the mind. Speaking of culture. So yeah, like I do what my software, my cultural values propel me to do. SVD and MVR, like substantialist reason in general, focuses on entities as objectively delimited parts of reality. And those entities are assumed to be discrete units of observation, like individuals, but also as like domains of action. And as a reminder, there's two subclasses of substantialist perspectives, plural, following Dewey and Bentley. One is self-action, where things act under their own powers, and interaction, where action takes place among the entities themselves, and it's the variables that do things, not social actors. Now, it's important to point out that mainstream value research is preoccupied, I would even say obsessed, with the variables. This is a 1956 paper by Herbert Blumer, which critiques much of sociological research of his time, precisely for this obsession with variables. An illustration, if a mainstream value researcher was to do an experiment in physics, that's my header. So speaking of variable-centered sociology, Stanley Lieberson, whose work I cannot recommend enough, give this illustration. Suppose a study in which a variety of objects is dropped without the benefit of a vacuum, just as would occur in non-experimental social research. If social researchers find that the objects differ in the time that they take to reach the ground, typically they will want to know what characteristics determine these differences. Probably density and shape will affect the speed of the fall in a non-vacuum. If they're fortunate, such factors together will fully account for all of the differences among the objects in the velocity of the fall. Applying standard social research thinking, they will conclude that there is a complete understanding of the phenomenon because all differences among the objects under study have been accounted for. Surely there must be something faulty with our procedures if we can approach such a problem without ever considering gravity itself. End of quote. So you see, no one in physics would take seriously a work like this. But if physicists had the mindset of many of value sociologists, that's exactly what they would be doing. Next slide. There's also the advocacy of noble substances, like here's a quote from this French philosopher of science, Gaston Bachelard: "A precious substance must be sought, so to speak, deep down. The commonly held ideal is nourishment or healing. Once a secret power has been attributed to a substance, you can be sure that the valorizing induction will know no further bounds." An illustration from mainstream value research, that's a regression model from variable obsessed Ronald Englehart. The dependent variable is economic growth. And as you can see, by adding the cultural value called achievement motivation, here highlighted, in model 3, the R squared, which means explained variance, jumps considerably to 70%. And the coefficient passes the test of significance here, which leads Englehart to conclude that cultural values have a direct impact on economic growth. Like achievement motivation is that noble cultural substance. And this is so interesting. There's this seminal text on how values ought to be investigated by John Dewey. Its title is Theory of Valuation from 1939. It's so rich that in and of itself, it gives more insights and deeper ones than all of the substantialist variable-centric texts on values combined. Interestingly, or tellingly, it's never referenced in those works and hardly referenced elsewhere. Now, Dewey's point is that researchers should study valuations, not values, i.e. not static things or symbols, but processes. Processes of pricing and appraisal, like, generally speaking, acts of flesh and blood, humans engaged in solving problems. Ignorance of values as processes is responsible for flawed assumptions. Flawed assumption number 1 is ignorance about values as material phenomena. In substantialist values discourse, the separation between symbolic and material aspects of action is implied at the very least. But crucially, valuations only arise in existential context. That is, once where there is something the matter, when things stop going smoothly. We say that even post-materialist values are materialist in that very basic sense that material resources, especially time, must be accumulated and skillfully spent in order to fulfill the related aspirations. And also materials values have a non-secondary symbolic component, and that's a quote from Karl Polanyi's The Great Transformation. Man's economy, as a rule, is submerged in his social relationships. He does not act so as to safeguard his individual interest in the possession of material goods. He acts so as to safeguard his social standing.
5 minutes.
Flawed assumption. Okay. Flawed assumption number 2. Taking desire to be original and complete in itself, independent of an observable contextual situation. For illustration, the 6 value spheres identified by Max Weber with reference to so-called ultimate values, like financial gain, domination, truth, caritas for religion, beauty, and mutual possession for erotic love, sexuality. It's crucial to point out that these 6 spheres are autonomous, disconnected domains for Weber, each obeying its immanent logic. The German term is Eigengesetzlichkeit, which is translated literally self-government by its own laws. Now, understood processually, values, which is to say valuations, become comparable rather than mere states of mind, detached from practical considerations. They stem from something lacking or absent in the situation, something that must be supplied if the empirical situation is to be complete. Flawed assumption number 3. That's the separation between ends and means. Dewey's quote is, effort, instead of being something that comes after desire, is seen to be the very essence of the tension involved and desire. And Dewey himself gives this illustration with the roast story. Roast pork was first enjoyed when a house in which pigs were confined was actually accidentally burned down. By searching in the ruins, the owners touched the pigs that had been roasted in the fire and scorched their fingers. Impulsively, bringing their fingers to their mouths to cool them, they experienced new taste. Enjoying the taste, they henceforth set themselves to building houses, enclosing pigs in them, and then burning the houses down. Only when the end attained is estimated in terms of the means employed is there anything absurd or unreasonable about the method employed. End of quote. Flawed assumption number 4, that's the separability of facts from values. That's because substantialist reason confers on thinking the capacity of reaching conclusions that are quote-unquote objective in the sense of being detachable from human concerns. But thinking and desiring are co-constitutive. They can be considered separately, but not as separate. That's our colleague Peter from Tallinn University and his co-author. As Mead himself explains in Mind, Self, and Society, quote, intelligence and knowledge are inside the process of conduct. Thinking is an elaborate process of presenting the world so that it will be favorable for conduct, so that the ends of the light of the form may be reached. And to conclude, well, very, very simple. Stop doing sociology of values. Substantialist values discourse is at this stage very similar to alchemy. Another quote from Bachelard, you think as you see, and you think what you see. A speck of dust sticks through an electrified surface, and therefore electricity is a glue, a very sticky glue, end of quote. To break with this view, recognize that values are processual, not decontextualized mental constructs that push, drive, or stick. Values consist in organized strivings toward ending views in order to make up for some deficit. To study values, therefore, we need an abductive research logic. And values, in the end, are not as interesting as substantialist value discourse suggests they are. Human conduct is evaluative by definition, which is to say that when you study conduct, you inevitably study valuations. However, substantialist values discourse is here to say, since this linguistic proclivity to favor substance at the expense of relations is buttressed by the fact that sociologists are always competing with other specialists in the representation of the social world, and especially with politicians and media experts who have a vested interest in such common sense thinking. And that's a quote from Loic Bacant, a Bourdieu collaborator. So that's my part. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Zoltán, and well within time. And next we have Kevin as discussant.
Do I jump in right now, or are we going to do it after the second presentation?
Yeah, I think we agreed to go with presentations and then
after the second presentation.
Okay, sorry, I got confused. I thought we were doing it in order. It's okay. Let's do it this way.
A discussion, yeah.
Let's do it this way. So let's do the second presentation. I'm sorry, I was out of sync there with the will of the room. Toni, Čerkez, please take it away.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. It's going to take me a moment to wash my palate of this very interesting reflection on values and sociology. I really enjoyed this, Zoltán. Thank you. And I do have some questions for later. So to start, my title is Beyond the Great Tradition and Cybernetics Towards Technodiversity and Relationality. The Great Tradition, as I will explain in a moment, is Hannah Arendt's concept. She uses it to, in a sense, deconstruct what she calls the great tradition of Western political philosophy and even metaphysics. And I think it tells us something about what's happening with big tech today, what's happening with the technological systems in which we are all, for better or worse, embedded, and which in many ways run and condition the politics, both internationally and locally across the world. Now, to kind of give you a sense of my argument, I'm going to first start with Arendt and her thoughts on the Great Tradition and René Descartes, because my argument here is twofold. On the one hand, we are all familiar with René Descartes' theory and philosophy of dualisms, nature versus culture, mind versus body. For Hannah Arendt, who reflected on Descartes intently, I mean, she gives a very similar reading of Descartes that we're used to, a very similar reading that will later be given by people such as Bruno Latour, Philippe Descola, that is today given by anyone who is thinking relations. For her, the significance of Descartes is such that he announced the birth of something she called the modern age, which was this kind of industrial, mechanical version of modernity in the West. And, he gave a philosophical articulation of the mechanical universe. And so the specificity of Descartes' dualisms is their mechanical nature, hard domain split on an ontological level. There's no possibility of non-human animals to be anything other but automatons. Arendt overlays, in a sense, and this hasn't really been theorized or thought through in this way, so this is kind of the originality of the reading of Arendt. Arendt overlays, in a sense, the dualisms created by Descartes. She, that is, both contextualizes them and overlays them with something that she calls the Great Tradition. Now, the Great Tradition in her reading begins with Plato and ends with Nietzsche and Marx, but it doesn't die out. We still feel its consequences in the world of politics, even today, but especially up until her own time. She died in 1975. Now, the Great Tradition postulated this ontological kind of dualism of mind and body in relation to the activity of philosophical practice of contemplation. So, Descartes, according to Arendt, gives us a philosophy of doubt and mistrust of the senses, which in a sense gives the birth to modern science, which is actually a science of suspicion, science of inquiry that does not take the world in its Aristotelian kind of experience. We do not, apropos Bachelard, according to modern science, see the world as it is. We do not understand the world as it is, so we doubt our cognitive capacities to interpret phenomena. Whereas the Great Tradition is a prejudice constituting Western philosophy's relationship with politics, that is, embodiment, performativity, and existence of what Arendt called a human beings inter esse, that is, in between each other. Now, the implications of the Great Tradition for Arendt were such that, of course, they evolved from her reflections on philosophers' life, which has been described by ancient philosophers themselves as an attainment of singularity through contemplation, Plato's emergence out of the cave and into the light of the heavens. And Arendt narrates the Great Tradition as, quote, from the human condition, the time-honored resentment of the philosopher against the human condition of having a body, end quote. The implication of that for her is the division of body and thinking. The body is an obstacle, in fact, to be rid of. Quote again from Arendt, My contention is simply that the enormous weight of contemplation in the traditional hierarchy has blurred the distinctions and articulations within the active life itself, and that, appearances notwithstanding, this condition has not been changed essentially by the modern break with the tradition. End quote. Here, Arendt essentially says that even in modernity, even with Descartes, right? The prejudice against the body, the philosopher's prejudice against the body, that is the Western philosopher's prejudice against the body. Arendt is actually very careful to always talk of Western political philosophy and not the Eastern, for example, political philosophy, and especially not, for example, indigenous philosophies of relations and politics, etc. And so she charges it in a sense with this problem, even, you know, after Descartes. This is kind of continued. And what we see is Descartes, in a sense, inscribing this philosophy of doubt and ontological dualisms of nature and culture onto the already ongoing mind-body dualism. So for Arendt, Descartes' articulation of, you know, mind-body dualism as such is nothing new, right? It is a continuation, in fact, of something that was started already by the ancient Greeks. Now, the implication of this for Arendt, the quintessential political theorist, is that philosophers always thought that they had privileged access to the truth, and that politics, that is the relations and negotiations vis-a-vis the world that happens between people, which was broadly Arendt's understanding of politics as a kind of more institutionalized practice, was a bother, right? Something to be managed. Politics is, you know, all of these people talking in the agora or in the square, and philosophers have no time for that, because philosophers see the true reality, because they have the access to the world, the realm of ideas. So again, Arendt argues that the tradition as such was destroyed by Marx and Nietzsche, not destroyed, but resolved in a sense, but that it still holds sway over political thought. And her critique of Marx was that essentially he kind of, and especially Engels, you know, with this whole idea of administration of politics, was that this was a culmination of the tradition's thinking that kind of gets reverted by Nietzsche's attack on God and transcendental and systematic values in modernity, etc. Now, what does this have to do with cybernetics? Now, it has become a consensus amongst philosophers, including Bernard Stiegler, Yuk Hui, etc., modern contemporary philosophers, that cybernetics surpasses Cartesianism because it destroys the dualism of nature and culture. It is logically post-dualist. Now, you know, for those who are not familiar, cybernetics, as articulated by people like Arturo Rosenbluth and Norbert Wiener, is a study and a science of regulatory communication flows. But as Norbert Wiener has underscored multiple times in his work, it has a much bigger and much more, in a sense, cosmological and ontological claim. And this claim is that insofar as we convert everything into information, insofar as we feed that information into systems, you know, that can recognize input and output values, which are computational systems, then there's actually not much, not a significant ontological difference between humans and animals. There's no significant ontological difference pretty much between anything in the world. So cybernetics as such is post-dualist insofar as we think of Cartesian dualisms. But I argue here, kind of borrowing from Arendt or using Arendt's discussion of the great tradition in an innovative way, that cybernetics instantiates, however, or not instantiates, but perpetuates a dualism of body and information because of its understanding of information. And information, according to Claude Shannon and Norbert Wiener and all of these guys who kind of worked on theorizing cybernetics, is a stable value that is extracted from material substrata for information processing, which is computation, which is how in cybernetics we obtain knowledge. Now, this dualism is reminiscent of the mind versus body dualism because the cybernetic system, which today, of course, includes machine learning, is seen as the objective mind, unhindered by the existence of the human body. And in this context, we can think of debates on I will draw in more carefully a bit further down, debates on big tech and how, in a sense, we're seeing the rise in transhumanist discourses on singularity, which are always embedded in a particular colonial logic of planetary escapism, Here, it's appropriate to mention, Elon Musk's goals of colonizing Mars, which are increasingly not just his goals, but are goals of private sector actors, big tech actors such as Jeff Bezos, but also institutions such as NASA, which is the American Space Agency, the US Space Agency. This all, in a sense, reminds me of Gunther Anders, who was Hannah Arendt's first husband, argument on the Promethean shame, that humans are, in a sense, when they look at their technological innovations, they are embarrassed by how successful they are, that we suffer from, quote, Promethean shame, which is to say that we suffer from the recognition that the disbelief in our own senses, the disbelief in power of human bodies to connect us to the world, and in many ways the disbelief of our own reason, to which we are all, at least under conditions of enlightenment, striving to.
5 minutes.
And good, because I'm nearing, slowly going to the end. Now, what about relations in all of this? So my argument is that cybernetics perpetuates the great tradition, even though it, in a sense, surpasses Cartesianism, because cybernetics is not a mechanical paradigm. Cybernetics is what Bernard Stiegler calls an organic paradigm, specifically because of the logics of feedback looping, which are organic relations. They move back and forth. We have machine learning. We have patterns that learn from patterns in unsupervised machine learning paradigms. These are very organic. So relations here, however, are seen as disembodied, even while not Cartesian. So there's something much more problematic that cybernetics via big tech claims, and this is a very reduced vision of cybernetics, I argue, that big tech advances. And this claim is that we do not need politics in relations. If we give our data, computational systems owned and developed and deployed by big tech actors can give us pretty much everything that we need. Feed the system an input so that it gives you an output that you would need. This homogenization of authority in the opaque and abstract computational system is a modern or contemporary reincarnation of Arendt's great tradition. Relations here are relations of input and output rather than relations of existential concerns, political concerns, life world relations. And here's a quote by Yu Hui from his work on art and cosmotechnics. So the human and the world become understood as a unity maintained by feedback loops. However, this feedback loop also creates a closed world of input and output, demand and supply, realized by and in the industrial world. Such a world based on reductionist cybernetics is doomed to be a closed one, and end quote. And if I may add to Hui, also a singular world, a one world. What of alternatives? And this is really what I'm trying to open to with this reading. Kind of relying on Yu Hui's work on technodiversity and cosmotechnics, which I will define in a moment. I think we can certainly work towards rethinking relations from within computational systems, borrowing from cybernetics, not just to theorize against Descartes, but also to criticize the traditional Western political thinking. Again, the body here as a problem is not accidental. The body here is the performative body, the female body, the Black body, the racialized body, the colonized body, all of those who haven't articulated their philosophies or their practices in the same way as, in a sense, we traditionally receive in the Western canon. Now, so technodiversity is Yu Hui's concept for, in effect, acknowledging the differential histories of techno-social developments. That is, that technology is not just a singular thing, for example, a Facebook as a social media, that we always have diversity inherent in ways in which we develop, design, and deploy computational systems. But even beyond that, technology is not just about computational systems. I take them as a kind of example of most relevant contemporary developments. And the first step is towards kind of alternatives, towards problematizing this one world of the great tradition and cybernetics, is acknowledging these differential histories. But the second step, I think, is very interesting, and that is what Hui calls cosmotechnics, which for him He defines it as the unification of moral and cosmic orders through technical activities, which is specifically referring to the cosmic character of these differential histories. I've recently stumbled upon very interesting work coming from Latin America. I think academics and people working in Latin America are pioneers in this regard. It's work by Renzo Orozco, David de los Reyes, and Benjamin Arnello on Catipana, cybernetics and cosmotechnics in Latin American art ecosystems. And what they propose to us is the following. In very simple terms, let's take an AI system and put it in the Amazon and let it train itself on the stimuli and information and data and behaviors coming from the multiple life worlds of the Amazon life system. Let's think of AI as a form of art and as a form of praxis that, in a sense, does not foreclose possibilities for deeper political and relational entanglements, engagements, problematizations, in the word of Gilbert Simondon. But let's take it let's take it as such, instead of, in a sense, a singular input to output operation, a statistical inference mechanism that, in a sense, dominates the world of artificial intelligence production today. For example, large language models such as ChatGPT, which are pretty much just statistical inference machines. I believe that with this deconstructive reading, through kind of cybernetic philosophy, through technology, but with the aid of Hannah Arendt, which ironically today a member of the Western canon, I think we can certainly illustrate the possibilities for other than relations with contemporary technologies in particular, but also recognizing that technology as such can never be separate from the manifold political and existential life worlds that we inhabit. Thank you very much. That will be me, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Toni. Now we're going to have Kevin as discussant. I do not see Victor in the room. So we're probably going to just keep going with the discussion.
Here, yeah, I just got connected with a different name.
Oh, hi, Victor.
Oh, Lord, there you are.
You are a bit fuzzy.
Yeah.
Oh, there you are. Perfect.
Should be better now.
Great. We've got everyone here. Okay, so first Kevin and then Victor. I hope we can, put together, it looks like very, very suggestive presentation. So let's see what we do with the discussion. Kevin.
Wonderful. Thank you. So thanks to both of you. They were super interesting. So I'm going to comment on Zoltán's paper, which I was able to read. We all received it. I was able to read it in advance, and I think I really enjoyed reading it. I think that I wanted to sort of provide my understanding of the argument, but also some of the implications of the argument that you're making, and maybe also ask some questions around concepts like valuations, which I think are super interesting, that are really pertinent for the relational sociological point of view. So one thing so you start off with this reflection on Mitt Romney and Mitt Romney's use of a particular view of culture. And I think that example, in a way, what it does is it illustrates some of the ways in which these ideas get taken up by basically powered interests. And so there's a kind of core here in the way that values are conceived, that it seems to me what you're arguing is that substantialism ends up actually serving basically culturally hegemonic ideas of civilizations. So in America, and so in a sense here, what we have is the idea of values, cultural values, and this is, you mentioned in a way the misreading of Weber's Protestant ethic. And you talk about how in the Protestant ethic, there's this relationship made between Protestant values and the emergence of capitalism. And then so Protestantism becomes this sort of priority value system that creates what many people think of as the most effective form of government. And then in the American context, we have this use of that idea to say, well, there you have it. You have basically a demonstration of the superiority of cultural values. And so the substantialist view of values therefore makes it sort of like this tight argument around, well, this is why the world is the way it is. And so in a way, this is, I think, one of the implications of the way that you're critiquing the substantialist idea of values, which I think is super, super important. And I wonder, in that way of thinking, another thing that came up to me, and this it's sort of, you bring it up in the section where you talk about noble versus corrupt substances. It also made me think in reading it about the idea that in some respects within this sort of substantialist science, we basically have also really imported a type of religious metaphysics around how we judge and how we value what is good or bad. And so we have noble and corrupt. And then in the context of noble values, we end up having this assumption around, well, certain values are, and in a sense, this is extreme, it goes straight to the colonial core. And we have certain values that are values that, I guess, purify the human condition, and other values that do the opposite. And there ends up becoming another instance of how this argument around treating values as these sort of effective things ends up becoming kind of a part of the way power plays out in the world today. One question I do have, though, that I find myself asking regularly, and I think that this is a question of relational sociology at the core, is if values are not, so in a sense, the idea here is the idea you propose is that we think of not of values, but valuations that are bound up with practice, valuations that are bound up with the ways in which human beings resolve issues in their environment. But what is to be said then about the idea of, for example, the sociological view that there are autonomous systems that do actually structure human experience, and that there are cultural values that, how do we sort of walk that line between the idea that values are not something that are necessarily structural, but that argument that is not necessarily relational, that values do have sort of a structural influence, or that do have a sort of efficacy. And how, because my sense is that a lot of the theorists in this substantialist approach, this would be their argument. It would be that, oh, well, if you look at the data, which there's a whole way of constructing data, people act according to their value systems. And so there's this sort of question about, well, values could be perceived as this sort of effective, as a sort of causal force in the life of humans. And there are lots of movements that I think, for example, I know that in cultural sociology, I'm not really sure how it maps onto this debate, but cultural sociologists argue specifically in favor of the autonomy of the values as a system of in society. So I just wonder if you had any thoughts on how to respond to what would likely be a critique at that level.
Thank you. Thanks, Kevin. And what we could do now is move on to Victor's comments of Tony's discussion. And I think I'm finding points of convergence. So very interesting. Thank you so much. Go ahead, Victor.
Yeah, so thank you both to Zoltán and to Tony for the presentations. I think it was really interesting to hear both of your pieces of research, and as Monica says, I think there's quite some convergence to be discussed. So I hope that we will discuss that. So I understand, Tony, that your research is still at an early stage, right? So there wasn't a paper, as far as I am aware, yet to be shared. But as I understand it, the paper that you're developing is mostly a theoretical paper. So I was wondering if you could talk a bit about the methodological aspects of your research, if you have thought about it so far. As it was, the presentation was very interesting to hear, to listen to, but there was quite a lot to take in. So if I have missed it, apologies about that. But I just thought that maybe I was missing that aspect here. So what I'm understanding that you want to achieve with your research is to take this relational approach to thinking about these AI systems, these like technology that is being developed now, and just approach it from these from this perspective. That so you're critiquing both these reductionist cybernetics that you're talking about, right? And you're also critiquing what Arendt described as this great theory. So yeah, just thought that maybe you could talk a bit more about the methodological aspects of your research, so how you're gonna approach it on your paper specifically.
Yeah, just wanted to jump in and say that I acknowledge, Victor, that it's a bit more difficult to discuss a non-existing paper. So I appreciate your engagement. The reason why I don't have a paper is because I've written so many papers in the last 2 months. I absolutely have no more energy. And I still have 3 or 4 papers to write. It's a big production. But anyways, I realized I'm not gonna take more time. I'm gonna let Zoltán go first. Yes, have rest. Thank you. But anyways, but I'll just say that actually delivering this presentation now makes me realize that I already have a paper. I just need to write it out because the argument is there. And I will respond to your comments, Victor, but let Zoltán go first.
Thank you.
Okay.
Go ahead, Zoltán.
Yeah, thank you very much for the thoughtful comments, engagement even. Yeah, I very much agree that there's this flavor of religious metaphysics, also in the Kantian sense that, especially speaking of those cultural substances that are deemed, they are portrayed as noble, like, purified in the sense of being disinterested. Yes, that's very, very, very Kantian. And I would add to the hegemonic discourse that it's not simply hegemonic in the symbolic sense, but it's hegemonic in the performative sense. It becomes hegemonic, a discourse, precisely because it translates as a means of physical coercion. Okay, so substantialist values discourse performs this function nicely, yeah, as illustrated with this quote from Romney. Now, to your point, to your question, I know that is there an autonomous system that structures human conduct or are there autonomous systems, plural? That sounds very Personian, persons, like Talcott persons to me. And you were referencing cultural sociologists, according to whom there are value systems or cultural systems that are autonomous in this sense, in the unembedded or disembedded sense. My response, based on all my empirical work and my reading of Dewey, Mead, Burst in particular, is a clear no. There are no autonomous cultural systems in this disembedded sense. So, dovetailing to Toni's presentation, I have these very, familiar with it, because one of the authors, Francisco Varela, was a Umberto Maturana contributor, and also the title is Radical Embodied Cognitive Science by Antoni Chemero. So these are guys from the field of biology, and what they end up with is that is the proposition that cognition is inevitably performative. Okay, you cannot extract a core of condition which would be autonomous of engagement with the world, practical engagement with the world. So if autonomy means detachment, separation in this very radical sense, as Parsons assume cultural systems to be, then my answer is a clear no. Okay, but it's extremely difficult to bring this message across because of the contamination by political discourse. Okay, so the contamination by discourse produced by those having a vested interest in, perpetuating this substantialist separation between symbols on the one hand and practical engagement on the other. So what I would conclude with that, speaking of cognition, there is no pure thought. There's also there are only dirty thoughts, which is say practical engagement with the world, stemming from human concerns and inevitably embodied. Okay, it's always embodied. Cognition is an embodied activity. That's what that's also my takeaway from Toni's presentation. Okay, thank you very much.
I see. Maybe you would like to respond, Kevin, or something popped into you're muted.
I just wanted to actually because I think I agree, and I wanted to just make the segue into actually how I understand this as relating also to Toni's presentation, in the sense that talking about independent structures, in a way, a lot of Western philosophy, back to Plato, was about what is the independent essence. We are always in the pursuit of that independent essence that is the active force, and sociology calls that structure. And I think that's one of the core ideas in this great tradition that Toni, which that's all I wanted to make. Yeah.
Thank you. Lots of really, really interesting ideas. I wonder if there's any more comments, questions. Toni, would you like to address the idea of methodology, that the question on methodology that Victor posed? Go ahead.
Yeah, again, thanks, Victor, for that, and thanks, Monica, for organizing this methodology. Well, look, the paper that I'm going to be developing from this, I've yet to think of where to send it. There's a couple of very interesting journals. One is more like ardent studies, more ardent connected. There are some really fantastic people working on it. But then I'm thinking maybe something more theoretical, definitely not classical IR, nor would I send it to an IR journal. I would aim for more like political theory or whatever. But so in terms of, but I want to, why I'm saying this is because I do want to keep it conceptual, at least in this instance. I see this as an evolving body of work. I started it in my PhD. And I think that I remember Chris mentioning that he will be chasing after, opportunities for us as ISRR to seek to publish something. I think in that case, I would want to develop something more out of this idea of technodiversity and cosmotechnics, which is where I would, in fact, maybe have a case study of big tech in relation to my conceptual work. Etc. But for this particular paper, my methodology will remain very conceptual, because I think a lot of work needs to be done, partly of bringing Arendt's great tradition in a meaningful way into cybernetics and relational political theory and all of these things. Not much of that has been even attempted. This is something, at least from what I get from literature on the great tradition and Arendt and technology, because there is some. Arendt did think about cybernetics a lot. It hasn't never been attempted. So I think I need to go more into theory now to bring it meaningfully into some sort of a theoretical construct, and then kind of work on more kind of empirical tests of sorts, of case studies of my own of this kind of theory. And again, I wouldn't be alone in some of these things, and think, as I mentioned earlier, Katipana, there's some great stuff great stuff happening. Again, here I will just mention Yukui's own work. He kind of started this whole thing. He was Bernard Stiegler's PhD student, and Bernard Stiegler was Jacques Derrida's PhD student. So there, and Jacques Derrida was working with Canguilhem, and Canguilhem is kind of the father of all of this. And also Gilbert Simondon was who influenced Deleuze and Bernard Stiegler and Yukui, but is not read at all, is at the core of all of this. It was also Canguilhem's PhD student. So I'm really working on teasing out all of these connections and deconstructions. Arendt here is certainly an outlier because she had no connection with any of these folks. Even though she was contemporary with Simondon, and yet she comes to some very similar conclusions, writing at the same time, borrowing, of course, from her teacher Heidegger's kind of deconstructionist method, and yet speaking to us relationists in this very essential way of criticizing, that is, Western political philosophy for forgetting the body, which you know, Arendt's explicit argument is that in the modern age, the Cartesian modern age, which is also the age of empire, not just the age of industry, it is also the age of empire and colonialism. She talks about this, right? The body has been seen as something to be destroyed. The body has been seen as something to be annihilated, largely because imperial and colonial systems put no value on body, because they philosophically did not think of body as significant. They thought of the access to truth, of race, truth and science, of capitalism, truth and science, of civilization as fundamental. And I think this has profound implications, actually, Arendt's own theory that these haven't yet been teased out. And obviously I acknowledge here Arendt's own biases and issues. There's a growing work of literature on Arendt's own racisms, slippages, and all sorts of things. But I do think at the core, she gives us a fantastic theory from within the Western canon, right? So I stick to the Western canon because I want to work through it, to criticize it, and, you know, but I am inspired, of course, by the work of people who do not operate from within the Western canon, or at least not consciously. And I just want to say, yeah, certainly. I mean, I think there's many connections that can be brought, not just between Zoltán's and mine presentation, but, you know, all of our work, in a sense, is responding in many ways, you know, building towards this idea of relationality. What I add on to here, in a sense, is this focus on the technological, the cybernetic, and, you know, people like sociologists and value theory, they all were profoundly influenced, whether consciously, again, or not consciously, by cybernetic theorizing, right? Cybernetics is something that has allowed ecology as a science to emerge. We wouldn't really have ecology as a science without cybernetic ideas, environmental sciences, etc. And yes, I did read Varela's Embodied Cognition. I think it's fantastic. Obviously, you know, some problems with it. Was written 91, so obviously that we can still take issue with some things. But I think also the work of Anne Catherine Hales in this regard is very instructive. You have How We Became Post-Human, not just that, but in How We Became Post-Human from 1999, she criticizes this idea of singularity, that you can kind of translate the human mind into a computer system and have it work as it did before, precisely because right, cognition is Anne Catherine Hales. So if that's the author you're referring to, and Catherine, there. I mean, she's incredible, yeah, she kind of challenges these ideas in the opening pages of that work. Very, very important. But she's a literary theorist, so you're gonna end up reading a lot about also literary theory in there. But yeah, that's the fun of it, I guess. Yeah,
thank you, Toni. Thank you so much. The workings for a very rich conversation are, I think, coming together. I see Alina's hand up, and then I'm going to insert myself in the speakers list. So please keep raising your hand, and I'll keep the list going. Go ahead, Alina.
Thank you, Monica. Hello, everyone. So I really enjoyed the two presentations. Thank you, Zoltán and Toni. I attend the sessions and listening from the background, as I come from the neighboring management field, but this has been fascinating. And I guess I have a question more to Zoltán. So I engage for my work with the work of Dewey and Bentley. And so you talked about self-action and interaction. And I guess I'm curious. So I think we understand so self-action and interaction as representationalist, right? So we represent the entities out there. And so the notion of transaction is more performative. So I guess my question is, how can we understand values from this transaction, doing Bentley's transaction notion? And how, I guess, the performative values, how can we conceptualize it? I guess also maybe my confusion comes from when you presented the slides about values doing the acting, it sounds very performative in some way. So I guess how will the values connecting with the doing Bentley's transaction, how can we reconceptualize them as performative, as transacting, as you mentioned, as kind of process, as kind of seeing them as processual and dynamic? I hope it makes sense.
Thank you.
Yeah, okay. Let me answer the question very briefly. A full answer would require several, chapters or articles, but let me say this. When I was in the concluding part of my presentation, I was saying something to the effect that values are less ontologically interesting than they are made to appear by substantialist values discourse. My suggestion is the following: values are not cultural values, so values in the symbolic, in the human sense, are not at all different. They're the same as thinking. The mental activity involved in the valuation, the process itself, is pretty much the same as thinking. So I would not differentiate between the two. And the lengthy quote from Values Doing the Acting, that was the substantialist take on values by Christian Belzel, a mainstream value researcher. That's not mine. That's not my point of view. So values are not independent. You were using the representationalist term, correct, Elena? Yeah. So Belzel is arguing from the representationalist point of view, that it's the objective, detached, contemplative, even contemplating a representation that comes first, without actual engagement with the word. So that's the wrong view. So I would suggest that, in effect, no, I would end up saying something even more radical. We should do away with the sociology of values as it exists. Speaking of the substantialist current, completely, because it's misleading. It's a fallacy. So what we should be doing is this, based on this abductive research methodology, explain cognition, thinking. Cognition is inevitably bound up with activity that passes for, that might be called valuation. Okay, that's my processual take. We should not, or very briefly, we should not differentiate between valuations in the processual sense and thinking. The two are exactly the same.
Thank you, Zoltán. And I have inserted myself in the list, and as you were talking, I had another question, but as you were talking, I was thinking in my head, would you say then that emotions are also right there entangled with thinking and with processes of valuation? Because we think from our Western academic perspective or tradition that thinking is all that matters here, but how about emotions and how generative they are in these processes? That's one question that just popped into my head as I was listening to you responding to Alina's question. But I'd also like to put out there in the table my thinking when you're talking about values as substances, and how that just leads to misrepresentations, but also how this is all framed in the mechanistic universe that Toni was talking about. And since I'm also working to criticize, take on how it is that cognitive evolutionary anthropologist Joe Heinrich talked about the weirdest people in the world, and how he says it's all about cognition and how we have evolved to certain aspects of our psychology. And he says it's the psychology of those who he calls weird, and the W, it's an acronym, and the W stands for Western, have reached this mind structure state through cultural evolution processes, I guess. But what he says is that this is like an unintended consequence of something that happened ages ago. I think it's like Catholics forbade marriage with cousins, and I'm still working through to get to a full critique of this argument. But what I'm getting to is he seems to be saying this way of being is better, but not really, because he says it's an unintended psychology. But in the end, he says weird people are tend to trust in strangers, to be less corrupt, to not engage in nepotism. And so in the end, the valuation ends up being better for weird people, even though he calls them weird, and it's unintended. And I find a lot of these, it's unintended kind of arguments through the mechanics, if you will, of the way in which culture has evolved or changed or transformed and got to a point, and then it's unintended. It's just like Weber saying the spirit of capitalism from Protestant ethics. It was unintended, right, that we got there, but that's where we got. And I wonder if that's a corollary of this substantialist mechanistic view of the universe, and that we get there, but then in the end, we still engage in processes of, or if you will, valuating these and these substances that we end up with as if they were substances and not huge processes where everything is entangled with everything else. And I wonder if I made any sense, and if you had anything to comment on it. And then I see Toni's hand up.
Can I respond right now to
For sure,
your 2 points?
Go for
Yeah,
it.
okay. Very briefly, to save time. So one is how emotions fit this template or enter the picture. I would add, if you mean emotions in the human sense, if they're in the sense of being different than pure sensory input from, which is, the animal world. When they involve emotions, thinking, especially in terms of, with reference to, with a not to meet, attitude taking emotions in the human sense, then yeah, valuations are emotions, and emotions are valuations. It's impossible. It's really a different vantage point over the same spot, or over the same geography, or over the same region. Yeah, emotions are valuations, thinking, etc. Interest. Also, very briefly, to your second point, speaking of this quasi-automated and in this way unintended, not intentionally produced courses of action, right? That's what you're alluding to. Is this substantialist in the way I was referring to substantialism? Not necessarily. I would say no. If you take Bourdieu's concept of habitus, okay, it's a durable disposition, which I don't like when Bourdieu uses terms like generating principle or generative principle, because this is in the disembedded sense. But Bourdieu makes it clear that habitus is very much is not disembedded at all from human concerns. It you know, habitus is a difficult term, but you know, what I take your illustration of this these unintended courses of action to be, they sound very much to me very much like habitus, which is not substantialist at all. In habitus, you don't have this separation between the symbolic and the material. Okay, it's unconscious, but it's very much human. Yep.
Right. Wouldn't you say it's related to the mechanistic view of the world? Sorry, I'm erupting here, and I see Tony's hand up. I'm just going to leave that question hanging. Tony, go ahead, please.
As far as I'm concerned, you can go and ask it. I do have a question, but I mean, okay, or keep it somewhere there and pop it in the chat. But my question, Zoltán, is that the argument you're making, though, you know, the presentation, I really thoroughly enjoyed it. And from this perspective of critiquing kind of discrete incidents and sociology, is much to be said about that. But I wanted to ask you, how do you then respond, in a sense, to people who are making, to some extent, similar arguments to yours? And I have kind of a sense here of processual sociology, of actor network theory, of Bruno Latour. I mean, his entire argument is that values don't exist, right, as such. Especially as kind of love, the idea of love, the idea even of capitalism, the idea of war, the idea, that's why, you know, he goes to Tolstoy, War and Peace. He says Tolstoy knew that there is no war because he kind of said that Napoleon was not this great person of history. He was just a guy who was in the middle of all sorts of relations, of decision making, etc., etc. So I wanted to just see how you respond to that, because what you are saying to some extent reminds me of, if not actor network theory, then processual sociology, for sure.
Yeah, I would very much agree with this proposition that your reference was, one of your references was here Latour, that values literally that values don't exist. Yeah, I kind of agree. Values don't exist. Values don't exist. Sorry, in this disembodied, symbolically representationalist, totally autonomous sense. They don't exist. So they're uninteresting in this sense. Yeah, I agree.
Kevin?
Thank you. I think that the idea that values don't exist, but it also touches on this comment that Elena made in the chat as well, the idea of the need to differentiate. So, for example, she says, if everything is relational and flowing, how can we understand things like thinking, valuations, emotions? There's this challenge. So to say values don't exist, I think we could say that, but the thing is, it's important, I think, to take another step and say, but that doesn't mean that there is not something evaluative. I think to me, in thinking about I think this is obvious. I think in this group we're aware of that, but it's one of these issues that often faces the relational processual argument. We're working against what is such a strong baggage and historical baggage, conceptual baggage, that the idea that, for example, saying values don't exist, I mean, to replace that, the idea would be I think it's important to stress, values are processes of evaluation, judgment, action, and I think there's something similar to be said about emotions, thinking, all of those things. They don't have the same status in a relational view that they would in a sort of like the more objectivist lens. that doesn't mean that they don't exist. I think that is the challenge, and I think that Elias in his work does a good job of showing how linguistic conventions sort of move us towards substantialist understandings, because language puts sort of words on objects or words on processes, and then those words end up becoming things we take for granted as objects, and that's how science ended up getting built. And so there's this sort of we have to sort of push back against so much baggage to make the arguments we're making. But
yeah, thank you. Thanks, Kevin. I see Alina's hand up since, sorry, Alison. Alison's hand up since first speakers. Go for it, Alison. Oh, you're muted.
Sorry, I thought Zoltán had his hand up before me.
I know, but you're first.
Oh,
first speakers first. Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
So a lot of these concepts, and I, not necessarily the ideas, are the way they've been presented to me. And thank you very much for your paper and your presentations. Very, very interesting. So I'm not quite sure if I'm missing the big picture and the point, but I'm just thinking in terms of actual embodied experience, particularly in the face of actual violence, whether it be physical violence or workplace non-physical violence, recognizing that all violence has a physical component to it, as well as existential violence. Like in the moment when someone experiences that, there are no values, there are no valuations, there is just response. And it strikes me that more so in Zoltán's presentation, but a little bit in Toni's, that all of these ideas come from people in positions of power, privilege, and safety, where they have the time, and because of that power and privilege, the capacity to respond with these valuations. And I'm just wondering if you could both briefly comment on where you see those experiences fitting into this. These big picture ideas of values, valuations, the great tradition, dualism, post-dualism, and all that kind of thing. Because it's all very interesting, but it also strikes me as very disconnected from actual experience of most people. And although we're talking very much about embodied experience and embedded experience, I'm not quite sure how those actual experiences fit into this, what we're talking about today.
Thank you so much, Alison, for bringing that point to the table. I was also thinking about the embodiment, Latour's theories and action network theory, and how it's all about humans and our technologies. And then we tend to forget about not just our embodiment, our own being organic matter, but also the environment. And I know Toni referred there to cybernetics and ecology, but it's also this kind of this embedded study of nature. Anyways, I'm gonna shut up and let Zoltán talk because we have a few minutes left. Sorry, Zoltán.
Yeah, my answer to Alison's question would be, you were alluding to how these experiences are lived by the oppressed. That's your, yeah. Yeah, let me bring in this differentiation between IQ on the one hand and EQ, emotional quotient, which becomes very fashionable, sexy. As soon as you accept, especially as a woman, that there is a fundamental difference between intellectual activity on the one hand and emotional activity on the other hand, then you simultaneously subscribe to substantialism, and you start exercising disciplining power on yourself. Because I mean, just based on my reading of the pragmatist tradition, especially Mead, intellectual activity, cognition, inevitably stems from EQ, emotional quotient, because that's the basis of, that's what attitude taking means, that you start thinking by representing the experience of your peer in your psyche. Okay, so at the basis, intellectual activity, cognition, is bound up with emotions. But if you accept this separation between the two, that, you know, these are very different activities, IQ on the one hand and EQ, emotions on the other hand, then you will start, especially if you are a woman, then you will start oppressing yourself. That's maybe it's a bit convoluted, but you see my point? What I'm getting at? As lived experience.
I cannot necessarily comment. I think at some point this kind of eludes me to some extent. I think Zoltán's point was really interesting, though I'm not commenting on that. But Alison, to be clear, I'm not, you know, in a sense, I recognize that I'm not theorizing lived experience here per se, but I am theorizing explicitly the kind of ontological underpinnings of systems, in a sense, that do have very, very strong effect on people today. That's why I keep on referring to big tech. And my diagnosis, in a sense, analyzes and excavates the principles upon which these systems operate, right? And affords them, in a sense, brings them into a wider intellectual history, thereby contextualizing them. So I do not have anything to say per se on, say, you know, how lower classes suffer from being left out of work, you know, the racism embedded in many algorithmic systems, but I'm very careful to acknowledge all of these things because they do form kind of the ethical underpinning of my own theorizing. But I just do think that in order for us to be able to even appreciate the kind of intellectual histories behind this kind of disembodied conception of relations, we do need to stay at the level of meta for a little while before we can actually deploy these concepts and these things in order to, in a sense, I wouldn't say serve, but in a sense, aid and serve the production of knowledge on the oppressed and on the oppression. So I'm, you know, a presentation is 15 minutes, so there are limitations. I did mention, in a sense, many times over, you know, that both Arendt and I and many other people do see a kind of a nascent computational colonialism in the world in which we live in. And this computational colonialism is not at all different to kind of your classical understanding of 18th, 19th century colonialisms, and say science as a form of ideology, reason as an imperialist conception, right? And this is, I resonate with that 100%. Because I do not necessarily defer to, let's say, ethnographic studies of indigenous peoples' political histories of oppression and livelihoods lost, that doesn't mean to say, in a sense, that my study cannot tell us anything about oppression as such. And I think at the core, oppression is about neglecting the embodied relation with life. All right. And this is quite literally, and I quoted from Arendt, this is in a sense her argument as well, like 60, 70 years ago. And I'm more than happy to take it on and see how we can apply to thinking big tech in a political sense.
And to an extent, your quoting of the Latin American cybernetics people also takes on that perspective. I was just wondering, how would you train AI in the Amazon? But maybe that's...
I will send you the project right now. Actually, they have a whole project.
Yeah, I really
it's very
would
interesting.
Love to read all your... It's just very interesting. Kevin, would you like to have the last word?
Sure, I'll make it very short. I don't want to talk too much, but I just wanted to comment on, Alison, you made a comment about how people experiencing oppression are not responding necessarily with values, if I understood that, or and if that's I may be misunderstood what you were saying, but I think that's actually probably, I would say absolutely they are. Of course they are, because I think that when you take values, if we're taking Zoltán's view of values as valuations, it means that all experiential, everything you do in experience has bearings of how you are marked by values and the way that your judgments and a lot of the times when it comes to oppression and oppressive forces, it has to do with the way that we normalize, the way that we, so for example, certain types of oppressions are acceptable, unacceptable. These are value judgments that end up being born in the body. They're the embodiment of how values work. And I think that it's one of these things, if we take concepts like symbolic violence and the way that ideologies work like that, then symbolic violence is basically the imposition of a particular valuation, way of valuing life that creates hierarchies, and those hierarchies are experienced, they're lived, they're practiced. And so I think that in a sense, the theoretical questions here, they're not theoretical. They're very much based on how do people experience the world and how can we experience it otherwise.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. It's 8:30 here in Secwepemcúlecw, and an hour and a half has gone by, and this has been a really amazing session. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining here today.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.